I'm glad that you've joined us for our time of study today. I'm Tim Smith with Sunday School University, and today we continue in our study in the book of Isaiah. We're looking at the lesson for Sunday, September 27th. The title of the lesson is God Reigns. So let me invite you to get your Bible, get your outline, get your pen, and let's get together and study God's Word. The title of this lesson is God Reigns. We're going to be in Isaiah chapter 23, verses 8 through 18. And the point that we're making is that God controls the rise and fall of nations and powers. In Isaiah 23, Isaiah delivered a judgment prophecy against Tyre. It's a fortified island city on the Mediterranean coast of Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon. The message was to remind God's people, as well as the people in the surrounding areas, that the Lord is the ultimate power, the sovereign power over all of the world's nations, their past, their present, as well as their future. Nations and leaders rise and fall throughout human history, and all of them are accountable to God. In Isaiah chapters 13 through 23, God made it clear that the pagan nations and the empires He used as instruments of His judgment would face accountability. Tyre was an international city of trade in both land and sea because of their location. Both Tyre and Sidon, its neighboring city, Sidon was the neighboring city to the north, were extremely wealthy and influential to the point of arrogance. Isaiah prophesied that Tyre would one day lose all of its wealth and would be forgotten. But after 70 years, the Lord would restore the city of Tyre, and the city's profit, their wealth, would be dedicated to Him. So let's look at these verses. In verses 8 through 12, we see that God is just. Who has planned this against Tyre? The bestower of crowns, whose traders are princes, whose merchants are the honored ones on the earth. The Lord of armies planned it to desecrate all its glorious beauty, and to disgrace all of the honored ones of the earth. Overflow your land like the Nile. Daughter of Tarshish, there is no longer anything to restrain you. He stretched out His hand over the sea. He made kingdoms tremble. The Lord commanded the Canaanite fortress to be destroyed. He said, "You will not celebrate anymore, ravished young woman, daughter of Sidon. Get up and cross over to Cyprus. Even there you will have no rest." In the first 7 verses of chapter 23, we see the judgment against Tyre. And as I said earlier, Tyre was an island city. It was very well fortified, and it was nearly impossible for an invading force to come in by land or by sea. Isaiah stressed that Tyre's downfall would come because God said so. In verse 8, while asking who could bring about the collapse of such a strong city, he makes statements to describe the city. He says the bestower of crowns. And he's talking about this wealthy, powerful city that could make or break the success of kings. Very influential. He says whose traders are princes. The powerful role of Tyre's merchant class. Again, the makers or breakers of nations. And then he talks about the merchants that are honored, the honored ones on the earth. They had a worldwide reputation. He says in verse 9 that the Lord of the armies, and we've talked about what that means, that he is the supreme commander of everything, he would be responsible for the future destruction. Again, this was a city that had the reputation that no one can conquer it. He says in verse 9, to desecrate all of its glorious beauty. And that, he said there, to stain its buildings. I think about the protests that we saw in our country and how many of our historical sites and many of our government buildings just made ugly by those who painted things on them. And that's what he's saying. He said, I'm going to stain your beautiful buildings. The things that you think are so glorious, I'm going to make them ugly. He says to disgrace all the honored ones. He's going to bring the powerful elite to a place of humility. In verse 10, he talks about Tarsus. Tarsus would be impacted by Tyre's fall. He describes a situation of chaos and many refugees leaving the city. So in verse 10, we see the inhabitants of Tyre leaving the city, refugees running out, trying to find refuge in other places. In verse 11, the question was whether all would recognize that Tyre's downfall was the work of the Lord. He says, stretch out his hand over the sea. The words there are like the parting of the sea to deliver the Israelites. In other words, he's going to do an incredible thing here, a miracle. He made the kingdoms tremble. That goes back to the way the people felt when the Israelites coming out of Egypt, coming into the promised land. The people heard about them coming and what the Lord was doing, and they trembled in fear. He says also in verse 11, commanded that the Canaanite fortress be destroyed, to destroy it as they took possession of it. In other words, what they did in the past was going to happen here. In verse 12, he depicts a panicked city of Sidon. He pictures the city as a young unmarried female having been beaten and raped. That's the way he describes her. You can't celebrate anymore. You can't have this carefree life, a life of leisure. That's over. The citizens of Sidon and Tyre would flee to the island of Cyprus in an effort to escape God's judgment. And he says, you're not going to have rest there. And what he's saying is that you're going to be constantly on edge, always looking over your shoulder, always fearful of that sound that you heard or who's around the corner to get you. And you can't even fall asleep at night fearful of what might happen. Well, let's look at verses 13 through 14, and there we see that God is active. He says, look at the land of the Chaldeans, a people who no longer exist. Assyria destined it for desert creatures. They set up and stripped its palaces. They made it a ruin. Wail, ships of Tarshish, because your fortress is destroyed. They probably thought, oh, this can't happen to us. Well, God reminds them of the power of the Chaldeans. They were the power not too long ago. They were at the top of the heap. They were the king of the hill. And now they're nothing. The Assyrian had defeated the Chaldeans. They had begun to push westward towards Syria, Israel, and Judah. God used the Assyrians as his instrument of judgment against the Chaldeans. And he would use the Assyrians and the succeeding empires as his instruments of judgments against Tyre and Sidon. In verse 14, when the fortress city of Tyre was destroyed, the ships of Tarshish would no longer have a safe harbor available to them. And what he's saying there is he paints the picture of a ship coming in and the port being totally destroyed, on fire. And here are these people that have been on this long journey looking forward to get there, all they see is destruction. Look at verses 15 through 18. On that day, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, the lifespan of one king. At the end of 70 years, what the song says about the prostitute will happen to Tyre. Pick up your lyre, stroll through the city, you forgotten prostitute. Play skillfully, sing many a song, so that you will be remembered. And at the end of the 70 years, the Lord will restore Tyre, and she will go back into business, prostituting herself with all the kingdoms of the world throughout the earth. But her profits and wages will be dedicated to the Lord. They will not be stored or saved, for her profit will go to those who live in the Lord's presence to provide them with ample food and sacred clothing. In verse 15, we see the fall of Tyre would last for 70 years. Evidently, the original audience of Isaiah, knew the song that he was speaking of. We see in verse 16 that Tyre was a city filled with idolatry and pagan fertility rituals. In other words, they were very free in their sexual practices. The city would be decimated under God's judgment and would no longer attract the wealthy merchants and their ships from around the world. It was going to happen. Their city would be forgotten like a used old prostitute. In verse 17, at the end of the 70 years, Tyre would be back in business. In verse 18, Isaiah saw that the restored city of Tyre would return to her old materialistic ways, but the profits would be used for a different purpose. In the past, it was selfish. Here, the proceeds would be used for God's purpose. And he says here in verse 18 that it's going to be used by the prophet or by the priest in the temple of the Lord. Now, I've given you some history here that the Assyrians came and laid siege to the city of Tyre in 722, but they withdrew after 5 years without conquering the city of Tyre. The Assyrians did. Nebuchadnezzar and his forces besieged the city for 13 years, beginning in 586, but they too failed to conquer the city. But nearly 400 years after Isaiah had spoken these words, Alexander the Great came and conquered and destroyed that city. a city that thought that it could not be conquered. It ultimately failed, and God's prophecy came true. What are our points from these verses that we've read? Number one, God is just in all that He does. Number two, God actively directs the affairs of His creation. Number three, God's plan includes all nations, all peoples honoring Him. Well, what can we do in this lesson? Well, I've given you some ideas to create interest. Remember that you try to do three things. Create interest, cover the body of the lesson. In other words, you're going to spend about 75% of your time in Bible study on those passages that we create interest. We spend time in the body of the lesson, and we also try to bring about application and closing. To create interest, here's an idea. Ask the group to discuss why people with great wealth sometimes struggle with happiness, peace, and fulfillment. Why do people struggle with those things even though they have everything? And then the application, the closing, ask the group, what encouragement and guidance does this study give us as believers and as citizens? Also, ask the group, how might your attitudes and actions need to change based on the reality that God controls the rise and fall of nations and powers? Well, remember, the title of the lesson is God Reigns, Isaiah chapter 23, verses 8 through 18. And the point of the lesson is that God controls the rise and fall of nations and powers. Well, I'll be praying for you this coming Sunday. God bless.